Hi, I'm Elizabeth Smith with the Ann Arbor District Library, and I'm here today with Veronica Williamson and Lindsay Willow Smith, who helped create the virtual exhibit, No, Not Even for a Picture, Re-examining the Native Midwest and Tribes' Relations to the History of Photography. This exhibit pulls materials from the Richard Port Jr. collection of Native American photography at the Clements Library. So first, thank you both for being here today with AADL and talking to me about this. So let's just start off with introductions and a little bit about your involvement in the project.
Yeah, bonjour, Lindsay Willow Smith, Indigenous Kazakh. But Veronica and I were both hired about 2 days before the pandemic began, and we were hired in person, and then we never saw each other for about 8 months. And so very quickly, it turned into a virtual exhibit, but we were both happy to be involved and involve Indigenous voices within the Clements Library. Veronica, I don't know what you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'm just going to say I'm Veronica, and I was originally hired as sort of the graphic designer for kind of posters, which quickly evolved into being like the website person, thinking through how we're displaying stuff online. And Lindsay and I sort of heavily collaborated on the content and the tone of the exhibit as we went through, which was really exciting. It kind of kept evolving.
I wanted to take just a moment to ask you about how the online format impacted the exhibit, since you mentioned that it wasn't initially going to be online and then it ended up being online.
That was like a really exciting part. It happened really quickly. Like they said, we met in person once and then very quickly knew everything would be online. And we wanted this to be accessible and not have to wait for quite a long time before people could access the content. And it actually informed a lot about how we thought about the project. Different questions were less important. So for example, the question of scale and like how people interact with the photographs was going to be harder to present online, but doing it online also opened up other avenues, like maybe having edited photos where we outline parts and highlight that, or having little carousels where people click through and have it be slightly more interactive than just looking at a static poster. And so that kind of changed the way we thought about audience interacting with the content.
Awesome, thank you. And I also wanted to ask about the collaborative nature of the project, because you worked with a bunch of different people, and I was just wondering how that process worked and if you learned anything along the way that you wanted to share.
Yeah, definitely. Veronica and I, we met a lot over Zoom to discuss how we were going to present the exhibit and deciding that we wanted it to be thematic and what themes we wanted to highlight, figuring out what would best represent the Port collection and deciding what would best represent Anishinaabe people. And trying to get a lot of different voices in the room. We were very thankful to have connected with Eric Hemingway of the Little Traverse Bay Bands, Vidawa, and Ojibwa Indians, and have his point of view on some of the things that we were using, and other Native folks in the room to express various viewpoints on our materials.
It also sort of grew such that whenever people were interested in working with the photographs, they would be maybe looped into our project meetings. So for example, some of the Port photographs were used in the University of Michigan Museum of Art. So we talked to their curators once just to talk about the photographs and how our projects might speak to each other across institutional boundaries.
That's really interesting. Did you end up coming out of that with anything?
There are a few photographs that are in the UMA from, I think one of them is in the exhibit and a couple are new. Currently they're in a drawer though, and you can't open the drawer because of COVID. So that'll be a stay tuned for that kind of thing.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And my next question is kind of related to the scope and the amount of materials that you were working with. The collection that you're pulling from is really large. How were decisions made about what to include and exclude?
Yeah, so the Port collection has about 1,000 images in it. And very quickly, we knew that we wanted to represent Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes and beyond, given where the Clements is located. And so that immediately cut down a lot of the possible photographs, because a lot of the images that he had collected were of natives of the Southwest and other, Plains region, et cetera, tribes. And then just figuring out, after we'd decided on the themes, what images best represented those themes and would talk to each other and would simplify pretty complex ideas like self-sovereignty into a couple of images that people who are not familiar or very familiar with the concept would be able to digest.
And some of the images just kind of immediately we knew would be in the exhibit. So an example might be how there was just a huge series of the Chief Shopinagon portraits that so clearly were playing with different ways of self-representing. Or another example might be the Potawatomi woman with the chair on with a photograph on it. So these images that already were clearly thematizing like acts of photography as kind of self-sovereignty or agency or ways of expressing that.
That leads perfectly into my next question, which is the exhibit focuses on questions of consent and agency, particularly in relation to photographic practices. How are these questions handled, and what do you think viewers should be aware of going into the exhibit?
These questions, I think they were really central to us personally, as well as sort of theoretically, in part because we're re-exhibiting these photographs, many of which the sitters could not necessarily give consent to, or we just don't know if they did. And so I think right away when we were working with these photographs, we knew that these questions were going to be important. And then just kind of the nature of how photography was growing in this time period, it became very clear that there was a really narrow focus here that was worth exploring and that had implications for the whole collection. And so that's sort of where the root came from. And then I think moving from there, we kind of really followed the photographs. Yeah,
I know there was a level of discomfort with working some of this material just as a curator and wondering, if the subject of the photograph had consented and what happened after that picture was used. One example that's highlighted in the exhibit is an image of Chief Joseph and other Namipu chiefs who had surrendered to the General Miles and were in Fort Leavenworth. That image was taken while they were in a prison camp, and it was then later used in a eugenics exhibit in New York City in 1921. And so just knowing that picture, that single picture, had been through so much that was obviously not consented to, and just knowing that other images had gone through similar experiences and we just didn't know about it, and feeling that we needed to be responsible for how we were portraying these images and keep that discussion in mind during the entire exhibit.
I think that's something that really stands out in this exhibit. I think everyone that you worked with, and you did an excellent job with that. And definitely there's some difficult material in there. And I also wanted to just address what else is available other than the photographs. Do you have a lot of resources available at the end of the exhibit? And I would like to ask you if you could choose one resource, maybe two, if you can't choose one, which would you recommend to viewers and why?
Yeah, I think my favorite thing we were able to add, especially because it was only possible due to the fact that it was an online exhibit, was the glossary, which has hyperlinks throughout the entire exhibit that will take you right to where that word is defined. We hadn't been able to find another one like it online anywhere, where an entire, massive list of words was defined from an Indigenous perspective and not, from like a bad textbooks perspective of what those words meant. And so being able to incorporate that into the exhibit was something that I was really happy with, and we've gotten a lot of really good feedback with.
I'll name like two resources and cap it at that in addition to the glossary. But I think one would be there's like further research projects suggestions. And that was basically where Lindsay and I put ideas that we knew we couldn't fit into this exhibit, but that would be really fascinating to study because, as mentioned, there are like 1,000 photos here and we were only able to use about 40 of them. So there's much more to be investigated and more stories to be told. And then the second is, after making the online exhibit, we finally were able to then make a poster exhibit. And these posters are sort of available for people to request the files for, and institutions can print them themselves and hang them in whatever spaces you have to kind of bring this exhibit physically to different places where maybe people don't have as much internet access, or they just want a different kind of experience of that. So those are two big ones that I'm really excited about.
Thank you so much for sharing. I also had a question about the physical exhibit. And what's next for it? Is it going to be put up in a museum or a gallery space?
Yeah, we've been working with the Saginaw Art Museum for the past few months to make a version of this exhibit in one of their galleries, and it will be opened in the next few weeks. So that's something we're both looking forward to and very excited to see.
Thank you. We will link the information for the virtual exhibit. And I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. And that's awesome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was great.